All right, stage 2 of our French Revolution inquiry, called the National Assembly. In 1788, the situation in France was becoming desperate due to everything that we learned about in the previous stage, and so the king decides that he's going to actually call for that meeting of the Estates General. So in 1788, the king says, all right, in the spring of 1789, we're going to have a meeting. I need all the people of France to come, or all the representatives of the different estates to come to my palace in Versailles, where we will convene a meeting of the Estates General to hopefully find a way that we can raise more money for France that will help make sure that we fix the food crisis in France, that will help make sure that France doesn't end up in as much debt as it used to be, and so on and so forth. So the representatives of each of the estates have a few months to prepare to come to Versailles, a French town outside of Paris, where the king would be for this meeting. In preparation for this meeting, members of the Third Estate who were going to the Estates General wrote down lists of problems that they wanted the king to fix. These lists became known as cahiers, and many times these lists could be almost book-sized, and there would be multiple volumes of issues that the people thought that the king needed to fix, and so many of the Third Estate members would mail these giant books full of problems for the king to fix to Versailles to await the representatives when the representatives arrived there on horseback so that they could just pick up their books that had been mailed ahead. When the representatives of the three estates arrived in Versailles for the meeting, the king told all of the estates that they would continue to vote when they needed to vote on issues according to the old estates system, which meant one vote per estate. This was one of the main issues that the Third Estate wanted to discuss at the meeting because they thought that the Estates General voting system was completely unfair. Because remember, they got one vote, yet represent 97% of the people in France. When the king announced on day one that this isn't going to be the way that it's going to happen, the Third Estate became super, super, super angry because this was one of the fundamental issues they wrote about in their cahiers. They demanded that the Third Estate be treated as if it was as significant a part of France as it truly was. 97% of the French population was in this estate. They ought to have more than 1/3 of the say in the kingdom. So, furious that the king's not going to change the voting system, the Third Estate is literally going to walk out of the Estates General on one of the first days that it meets. So the Third Estate stands up in a meeting of the Estates General one day, and all of the representatives simply walk out of the room, leaving the king, the First Estate, and the Second Estate there, kind of open mouthed, like what just happened. And that was because the Third Estate claimed that because they made up 97% of the French population, they actually had the legitimate lawmaking power of the government. Because they believed in Enlightenment ideas, like the ideas of Locke, that the power of a government comes from the consent of the governed, and by claiming that they were 97% of France, which they were, they actually had the ability to make laws because they were a better representative of the people than were the First and Second Estate and the king, who only represented 3% of the French population. So basically, because 97 is greater than 3, they claimed that they had the ability to make laws. And so these Third Estate representatives that walked out of this meeting are now going to call themselves a new name. They're going to call themselves the National Assembly, and they're going to meet in a different room separate from the First and Second Estates and the king, where they're going to act as if they have all the power in France to make all the laws. This is going to make the king super angry because no, in his mind, the king has the power to make all the laws and decide what the rules are, not these petulant upstart peasants who are screaming at him about rights that they deserve because of a book that they read. So what the king's going to do is the king is going to say that the next morning, when the Estates General meets and when the National Assembly is scheduled to meet, the king's going to order his palace guards to literally lock the doors of the room that the National Assembly was planning to meet in. So, if you can't meet, you can't make any laws, and maybe you'll then have to come back to the Estates General and make up with the First and Second Estate who are angry at you. So when the National Assembly arrives at their meeting hall the next morning and they go to open the doors and they find it chained shut, it actually begins to rain. So now the National Assemblymen are stuck in the rain. What do? They're going to run across the road to an empty tennis court, an indoor tennis court, where all hundreds of the representatives can fit. And inside this tennis court, they, angry at the king, are going to make a promise. And this promise is going to be that they are going to not separate and promise to reassemble wherever circumstances require until a constitution for the Kingdom of France is established. And this promise by the representatives of the Third Estate, now called the National Assembly, to not separate, to stay together until they create a constitution for France, has become known to history as the Tennis Court Oath, because it's a promise to make a constitution taken on a tennis court at the Palace of Versailles. So when the king sees this and hears about this and realizes that his plan to just lock them out of the room and cause them all to collapse in frustration didn't work and they just went to a different building, has now caused the king to be in sort of an awkward position. Because if he goes over to this tennis court and orders that all the different representatives of the Third Estate be arrested, he's probably going to be pretty close to a revolution, because think about how that news story gets published. King arrests representatives of 97% of France who promised to create a constitution, tells them no constitution, and locks them in prison. That's a pretty good way to get most of the people of France to start trusting the king even less. So in this awkward position, the king is actually going to go to the National Assembly and accept some of their demands and says, listen, you guys can make your constitution. That seems like a good idea. There's a lot of people that want a constitution in France. Let's do that. And if you come back to the Estates General and participate in the old government, I will let the voting happen by representative, meaning each person that came to the meeting in Versailles for each different estate will get to cast one vote. The Third Estate thought that this was a pretty good compromise because they, as an estate, had the most representatives at this meeting, meaning that they would have a much more significant say in what happened inside France than they used to when they only got one vote, because now they will get several hundred votes. They got more say. So the king meets some of these demands, but remember, the big thing here is the National Assembly, this new group of people that claim to be able to make laws, has promised and been told that they are allowed to create a constitution for France, and that's what they're going to do. Less than a month after the Tennis Court Oath and the meeting at Versailles that almost turned ugly, the people, the National Assembly, and the estates, and the king have gone their separate ways. And so the National Assembly has traveled back to Paris, which is a few miles from the Palace of Versailles, where the Estates General met. The king has stayed at Versailles. And the National Assembly is in Paris trying to make the constitution that they promised they would make at the Tennis Court Oath. In this sort of tense moment where the king has given up some of his powers to this National Assembly and they're separated by about 15 miles, there's a lot of tension. And the people in the National Assembly are super worried the king's going to come violently try and put them down to reassert his control. And at the same time, the king is worried that the National Assembly is going to raise an army that's going to come violently put down his rule. So we've got these two different groups that are very, very suspicious of the other group, thinking, oh my God, how's this person going to come and try and take my power away? Well, neither of them are actually going to try and take each other's power away, but their inability to communicate effectively is going to lead to them coming in direct conflict with one another. So in one morning, one of the guards on the walls of Paris sees a large dust cloud approaching from the road that leads to Versailles. And every few minutes, this dust cloud appears to get larger and larger, indicating that a large group of people is marching towards Paris, raising this giant dust cloud. Because remember, at this time, roads are largely dirt. So if a lot of people are walking on a dirt road, a lot of dust is kicked up in the air. And you can see that for miles ahead, especially if, hundreds or thousands of people were marching down the road. So when this representative or this guard on the city wall sees this huge dust cloud coming from Versailles to Paris, this person panics and assumes, oh my God, the king is sending an army to Paris to arrest the National Assembly and reassert the king as the absolute controller of France. So this messenger, or this watchman, sprints down from the Paris walls, runs to the National Assembly and says, oh my God, the king's sending an army here to arrest us. This sets the National Assembly and the people of Paris who supported the National Assembly off into a panic because, oh my God, if the king's coming with his soldiers to arrest us, we're never going to get the constitution that he promised us. We're never going to get our rights. We're never going to get the Enlightenment values. Panic, panic, panic. So the people in the National Assembly and the French citizens who support them decide, we need guns, we need weapons, we've got to be ready to defend this city from the French army that's coming. And so what they do is they run to a part of the city of Paris called the Bastille. The Bastille is an ancient castle that functions now as a prison for a lot of political opponents of the king. So if the king doesn't like you, he'll have you locked up in the Bastille. But also because the Bastille is massive, it is an armory, an area where weapons and cannons and gunpowder is stored for the defenders of Paris if Paris is ever attacked. So the National Assembly and the people sprint up to the Bastille in order to get the weapons underneath it, to bring them out to defend Paris from the quote-unquote king's army that's marching towards them. P.S. There's not really an army marching towards them. It's a big miscommunication. But the guards at the Bastille are loyal to the king. They're not going to let a mob of people who are angry at them come in and take all their guns and cannons. And so they tell the people, no, you can't come into the Bastille. And the people say, oh, we sure can. And so what happens then is eventually somebody shoots. It's always been unclear who fired first, but either the person on the top of the Bastille or the people at the bottom of the Bastille, somebody shoots at somebody, which starts chaos. There are only about, and I've read some different reports, there's only about 8 guards in the Bastille, and there's only a few prisoners in the Bastille. And so very quickly, the mob of hundreds of people from the National Assembly in Paris that are outside of the Bastille are going to break down the doors. They're going to storm the Bastille, and they are going to kill the guards that are there protecting, I guess, the Bastille from people invading it. They're going to steal all the guns, and they are going to march around Paris with the chief prison guard's head on a spear to symbolize how they can violently overthrow the king if they need to, and the people are going to have weapons to protect themselves. Well, come to find out, that was not an army sent from the king to get rid of the National Assembly. It was an army sent by the king to Paris to help put down any mob violence if there were revolts because bread prices were too high. But these soldiers were not told to get rid of the Third Estate, so as the soldiers came to Paris, there actually was no conflict between the people and the soldiers. The only conflict was at the storming of the Bastille. But this moment showed how the people of France took this revolution so seriously that they were willing to kill in order to keep the rights that they believed that they deserved to have. And so I think that's why people think of this moment as such an important moment in the French Revolution, because it shows we're at that point where people are going to kill if they have to kill in order to get these rights, because they think these rights are so important, like having a constitution and having a representative body like the National Assembly that actually represents the people of France. The last part of this stage is something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. By August of 1789, the National Assembly changed many French laws to a more enlightened system, and one of their biggest achievements was this document called the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. This document outlined the guiding principles of the revolution. It included the 3-word famous slogan of the French Revolution in it, which was liberty, equality, and fraternity. Freedom, equality, and brotherhood being the things that the French constantly chanted and wanted in their government. The document was inspired by the American Declaration of Independence and guaranteed rights like freedom of speech, religion, and freedom of the press. So by August of 1789, the National Assembly created that document that they promised they would create on the tennis court oath a few months earlier. And so now we're at this awkward moment where the National Assembly has completed its purpose. It's made the Constitution that it promised it would make. And so what happens next? And that will be our next stage, stage 3.